Welcome to the Department of Southeast Asian Studies seminar series. I think this is the third seminar of this semester, and we've been ranging through a variety of different terrific topics. I hope you've been part of those discussions in the past. My name is Iti Abraham. I'm the head of the department, and it's a real pleasure for me to have with us today, all the way from California in the middle of the night, Kris Alexanderson, who has recently become Associate Professor of History at the University of the Pacific. Some of you will know Kris's work or will have heard of her work. Her book, Subversive Seas, Anti-Colonial Networks Across the 20th Century Dutch Empire, published by Cambridge, was a really terrific book, which looked particularly at maritime networks, but also focused on the ship itself as a site of teaching, of pedagogy, but as well of sort of exemplifying the hierarchies and the segregations of the Dutch Empire itself. She's published her work in other places, in other venues as well, including the Journal of Social History, Journal of Pacific History, Early Modern History, Military History, as well as other book chapters that, if I go on, will just take too long to mention. Kris is going to be talking today based on this book. She's also got a new project underway, which, if we're interested, she's willing to talk about in the Q&A section. But for the moment, let's just focus on the presentation today and the book. Her title is Regulation and Resistance at Sea, Rethinking the, quote, in-between spaces of the Dutch Empire. Kris, thank you so much for coming, and it's all yours now.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to Iti for inviting me to speak at the seminar today. And thank you to everyone who's shown up today. I'm very excited to share a little bit more about my research, and hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion at the end of this. So I talk about the oceanic world in the 1920s and 30s. In my first book project, which is what I'll be talking about today. And this is a time when the oceans became more congested, they became increasingly contentious, and they became less controllable as oceanic networks helped to facilitate exchanges that ultimately destabilized colonial power. And in terms of the Dutch Empire, compelled the Dutch to extend their influence beyond Southeast Asia through transoceanic projects of surveillance, policing, and control. What's essential in unraveling this transnational scope of the Dutch Empire during the interwar period is understanding that imperialism did not merely exist within the spaces of metropole and colony, but rather was a transoceanic and a transnational project that spans the globe, revealing how this oceanic empire functioned and the ways it both supported and subverted terrestrial forms of imperialism presents a more complex picture of not only the Dutch Empire, but all empires during the early 20th centuries. So while oceans are seen primarily as conduits between terrestrial locales, and these terrestrial locales usually are assumed to be places where the most important dynamics of empire, the most important dynamics of history are assumed to take place. But oceans, in fact, were mutually dependent, and terrestrial spaces and oceanic worlds were mutually dependent on each other to transport goods, to transport people, to transport information and ideas that were all required to ensure the logistical integrity and, especially for imperial powers, the profitability of the imperial project. So my, there we go. So my research repositions the oceanic world to the center of the narrative. It uncovers the mechanics of transoceanic empire, and it exposes the oppositional yet interconnected histories of movement and transgression and fluidity on the one hand, and rigidity, hierarchy, and control on the other hand. I explore the actual mechanisms of imperial oversight and of anti-colonial resistance outside the confines of colonial Indonesia. And I try to answer some of the following questions. What exactly did colonial control and surveillance look like in the maritime world? How did shipping companies participate? What were the connections between maritime and terrestrial systems of surveillance, regulation, and control? How did the maritime world function as a space of anti-colonial resistance? So I'm sure that many of you are somewhat familiar with Dutch maritime historiography, but you probably have read more about the VOC during the so-called golden age of the Dutch seaborne empire. And certainly this rich historiography and really the advanced theoretical considerations of early modern Dutch maritime history are very important. But this is not matched in the historiography of the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think that these periods perhaps have captured fewer imaginations amongst historians of the Dutch Empire, but the very structures inherent to modern imperialism have also played a role in this disparity. So Sugata Bose notes that colonial frontiers themselves came to obstruct the study of comparisons and links across regions, and ultimately left a lasting legacy, a general narrowing of scholarly focus within the framework of area studies. So it's important for imperial historians today to sort of reconnect these different areas of the globe. And my analysis begins in the 1920s. It begins as the political atmosphere in colonial Indonesia is changing drastically, due to the uprisings between 1926 and November 1926 and January 1927, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with already. These uprisings broke out first in Western Java and then Sumatra, and there was swift suppression by Dutch police and military forces that ended, both sort of periods of these uprisings within a few days. There was one Dutch officer who was killed, but there were thousands of Indonesians who felt the effects of the state repression that followed these uprisings. And of the 13,000 arrests that were made after the uprisings, 4,500 people were sentenced to prison. Over 1,300 were interned at Bovendigel prison camp in colonial New Guinea. And eventually the number of interns at Bovendigel reached, close to 5,000 people who were all deemed a potential threat to the law and order of the colony. Now, what's important here is that the maritime world played a very important role in the subsequent imperial project to clamp down on what it saw as being subversive people and ideas. And although we think about sort of shipping, by the time we get to the interwar period, we think of it as being very technologically advanced. And we think about, systems at least of technological hegemony being, pretty powerful in terms of control over seas and control over shores. But the Dutch government still viewed the oceanic contiguous spaces around colonial Indonesia as what they termed wild spaces. They saw these spaces as very dangerous and as spaces where both sort of anti-colonial activists might sort of escape the repressions after 1926 and 27, and also where anti-colonial activists, ideas, propaganda could enter the colony from abroad. So, it's important to understand that the reason why oceans were considered to be so dangerous and also so important and part of this surveillance project in the late 20s and 1930s was that it was assumed that at the end of 1926 and 27, these uprisings were actually due to foreign influences entering the colony's shores from abroad. And Stoller calls this the phantom of external agitation. So rather than acknowledging a homegrown movement that was reacting to inherent shortcomings within the colonial system itself, Dutch popular opinion, this was true both in terms of the colonial administration, but also in terms of sort of public opinion in Dutch public opinion within Indonesia and also in the Netherlands, really felt that this was due to sort of a foreign influence coming into the colony. In addition to this, the Dutch colonial surveillance records show that there were serious concerns that activists and other people who were involved in these protests, who were not killed, who were not imprisoned in the months following the uprisings, were assumed to have fled the colony on board ships that were bound for ports across not just Southeast and East Asia, but also the Middle East, in ports associated with the Hajj pilgrimage, and even further afield to ports like Vladivostok and to New York, to Hamburg, to Rotterdam. And indeed, you know, some Indonesians did take advantage of these global maritime networks that facilitated the exchanges of anti-colonial activists and ideologies and propaganda and weapons from port cities, not just across Asia, but around the world, connecting these port cities with colonial Indonesia. So Dutch surveillance and policing policies were greatly expanded due to these sort of colonial insecurities that were being felt after 1926 and 27. And the ethical policies focus on modernity and technological innovation inadvertently helped promote increased state surveillance. So Martin Thomas explains that surveillance itself was an outgrowth of scientific modernism. And the the surveillance undertaken in the colonies in the late 1920s and 1930s was undertaken by the Dutch Political Information Service, the PID, the General Investigation Service, and the ARD. And the ARD began, it's the Algemeen Recherchedienst, or General Information Service. They began distributing a monthly circular called Police Political Surveys that contained surveillance updates from sources across the archipelago. And they were sent to, these reports were sent to police and administrators throughout colonial Indonesia, including the Governor General. And this circular helped infuse the entire Dutch administration with a sort of surveillance psychology and a policing-centered mentality. And I just want to mention here that the police political surveys divided their surveillance efforts into 5 categories. The most important one that got the most resources given to it was the nationalist Muslim movement category. The second most important category was trade unionism. And the other ones were Chinese movements, extremist movements, and foreign movements. So this will come into play when I talk a little bit more about the chapters in my book, that the national Muslim movement was surveilled the most, followed by trade unionism. And this reflected sort of concerns over pan-Islamism and communism being these very sort of threatening ideologies in the eyes of Dutch colonial authorities. Let me switch here we go. So the same fears and paranoia that were felt by the colonial government over threats to their own authority were also shared by maritime businesses, which became increasingly protective over their interests in the years leading up to Japanese occupation. And my book talks about sort of 3 areas of Dutch shipping. The first is Hajj pilgrim shipping between colonial Indonesia and the Middle East on board the Kongsi Tiga, the trio line. And that was made up of, on this map, the first 3 companies up here, the Rotterdam Lloyd, the Stoomvaart Maatschappij Nederland, and the Stoomvaart Maatschappij Oceaan. They worked together in a monopoly that had 3 members that controlled Hajj shipping from Indonesian ports to Jeddah. The second kind of shipping I'm going to talk about focuses on Asian shipping on board the Java, China, Japan line, which connected colonial Indonesia with China, Japan, the Philippines, colonial Indochina, and colonial Malaysia. And finally, I talk about passenger liners that were run by the first 2 companies here on the screen, the Rotterdam Lloyd and the Stoomvaart Maatschappij Nederland. They worked together. They were known as the Dutch Mails, and they linked their sort of transoceanic maritime networks with the KPM, which was in charge of intra-island transport within colonial Indonesia. So all of these companies, all these 5 companies I want to point out, they all shared this common goal in eliminating competitors. They formed conferences, which were cartel-like agreements with each other, and they controlled these oligarchic shipping pools where they set rates for cargo and passengers, and they functioned as collective monopolies by binding the companies together through royalties and rebates that guaranteed sort of exclusive use of conference ships. And this discouraged not only external competition, but also internal competition between the conference members as well. So you can see that, obviously there were many more Dutch shipping lines than just the ones on this map, but I focused on these because these were sort of the most important maritime shipping networks that really connected the colonial Indonesia with the rest of East Asia, with the Middle East, with South Asia, and with Europe. So together, these 5 companies really worked together to control this realm of shipping in terms of the Dutch colony. Okay. And obviously we can, the shipping from Singapore is a big part of this project as well, but the Dutch companies were not based in Singapore, right? There was another group of shipping companies, largely British. Okay, so the widespread mutual cooperation between these 5 shipping companies was also apparent between the shipping companies and the Dutch colonial government. And this is a relationship that historian Joop Ocampo terms as a bilateral monopoly. It had a very strong vertical integration in the structure of Dutch shipping. And the colonial administration set up a lot of liberal economic policies that helped stimulate colonial Indonesia's shipping industry in exchange for the support of these shipping industries in terms of imperial ideology and in terms of imperial policy, right? So this was a relationship that worked for both ship owners, right? Because they were getting things like loans, they were getting, as we'll see a little bit later, they had specific laws. There were lots of laws set up that made it very difficult for anyone to challenge Dutch shipping monopolies. And at the same time, the Dutch government very much called upon these shipping companies to help it in its international surveillance projects, in policing projects, and it expected when necessary that the company would forego its profits, that it would forego a profit margin in order to uphold sort of imperial hegemony and imperial policies. And we find that for the most part, that's true, that Dutch shipping companies sometimes worked against their own profits in order to uphold these colonial hierarchies at sea and, overall sort of hegemonic policies that was asked of them by the colonial government. So I just want to talk a little bit about the sources here that I have been using. I've used a lot of Dutch, what previously were known as sort of the secret archives, secret government archives, which now have been declassified. And I use Dutch shipping company archives, and the Dutch shipping, I also use colonial consulate archives from Dutch consulates that are based in port cities around Asia and the Middle East. But the shipping company archives are really interesting, and I just wanted to mention them briefly because often I think business archives are assumed to be sort of primarily financial in nature, but the Dutch shipping archives reveal the sort of minutiae of day-to-day business concerns, including, interactions with individual customers, with local agents, with correspondence with the Dutch government in the Netherlands, with the colonial administration in Batavia, with foreign consulates, with competing shipping lines around the globe. So the shipping company archives really reveal a lot of experiences of individual passengers, crew members, and agents that I think help to reveal a really multi-dimensional picture of the Dutch Empire's networks and counter networks. So I wanted to just mention that because I think there's more work to be done in business archives around the globe, and maybe we can have a conversation about in the Q&A as well. Okay. I do just want to say one thing before I get into the chapters of the book, which is that, you know, despite the oligarchic conferences and the close relationship with the government, of course, in reality, it was impossible for any Dutch shipping company to command absolute authority over the world's fluid oceans, right? So this was a really sort of unsuccessful project, because despite things like rate fixing and through freight policies, these things were useful if you were negotiating with companies that respected the conference system. But of course, we know that in Indonesia, there were so many local Chinese shipping firms, there were Indonesian coastal vessels, there were other competitive firms, there were many Japanese firms, but there were other competitive firms that really had fewer reasons to negotiate with the European conference system. And often these ships operated more cheaply than Dutch liners. They exercised more freedom. They exercised more flexibility in terms of scheduled routes and their ports of call. And so therefore, you know, these kinds of ships which the Dutch shippers called Mosquito Fleets, and I think the word mosquito sort of shows you their opinion of these kinds of ships, that these Mosquito Fleets, as they called them, were continued to be extremely popular forms of maritime transport across Southeast and East Asia for both passengers and for shipping cargo as well. Okay, so this is an outline of the chapters in the book. There's 6 chapters, and part 1 at sea looks at the 3 different kinds of shipping companies that I mentioned earlier. And together, these 3 areas of shipping reveal how political ideas and how cultural practices help to define onboard spaces. So by looking at the ships themselves, you really can highlight the very contentious realities of the maritime world, and also see exactly how oceans became so central, why they were so central to the Dutch imperial project. Part 2, in port, moves from the spaces on board the ships to networks that connected ships with port cities, right? So this second part of the book like seeks to contextualize the position of Dutch imperialism within sort of global politics. It looks at cities like Jeddah, Shanghai, Xiamen, or what was then Amoy, Kobe, and looks at sort of the anti-colonial political struggles, as well as the policing and surveillance networks that help to intertwine the maritime world with port cities and sort of littoral coastlines, and ultimately looks at, you know, the ways that transoceanic politics worked as an entire maritime network, both at sea and in port cities. Okay, so chapter 1, I start with Hajj Ships, transporting pilgrims from colonial Indonesia, primarily to Jeddah. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this traffic was very suspicious to the Dutch authorities in the late 1920s. And this wasn't new. I mean, the Dutch were suspicious of Hajj pilgrims beginning in the 1800s, and had enacted various laws over the course of the 1800s trying to exert more control over this movement of people. And by the turn of the century, the establishment of Kongsi Tiga, of this shipping monopoly, really helped the Dutch government to feel like they had more control over this movement of pilgrims. And in the 1920s, this control was sort of intensified due to a new Hajj Pilgrim Ordinance, which was passed in the year 1922. And this, just to show you, just to explain the slide that's here, this gives you an idea. These numbers give you an idea of the importance of Indonesian pilgrims in terms of the total traffic that was coming from Southeast Asia specifically, but also South Asia as well, right? This was a very, very lucrative form of shipping for Kongsi Tiga. And for instance, between 1919 and 1940, the three shipping companies of the Kongsi Tiga earned about 90 million guilders just from this trade, which equates to about $1.5 billion today in US dollars. So it shows you sort of how economically important this traffic was and why the Dutch government and shipping companies would have been so interested in controlling this and making sure that they maintain their monopoly. Let's see. So the 1922 Pilgrims Ordinance creates a vast amount of paperwork. Each ship has to now have 4 different sets of documents that they bring with you, and they present to port authorities in the port they're leaving from. They present them to the port authorities in Jeddah. And pilgrims themselves increasingly have to have more and more extensive personal identification, not only through sort of identification papers, but they also need to apply to local offices in Indonesia to have their travel documents in hand, and they have to work with the Dutch consul in Jeddah as well. So part of what the 1922 Pilgrim Ordinance does is to really create this intense surveillance paperwork, right, that the Dutch can use to sort of track names, track movements. They can cross-check like information. When pilgrims return to Indonesia, they also need to sort of check in within a few weeks of their local their nearest Dutch authority, which was sometimes a very big deal because you had to travel a long distance. So anyway, this was meant to really like track the movement of individual pilgrims from the sort of start to finish in terms of their pilgrimage. And on board the ships themselves, beyond all this paperwork, the shipping companies themselves saw certain types of passengers on board as being very dangerous. This was a very, ultimately a very sort of racist ideology around the power that they saw of Middle Eastern Arabs traveling on board ships with Southeast Asia, with Indonesian pilgrims, who they thought were very naive and they thought were easily swayed. And they believed that sort of Hadrami Arabs who were traveling back and forth between the Middle East and Southeast Asia, as well as some of the sheikhs, a lot of sheikhs were from Indonesia, but some sheikhs were also from Mecca, that these were groups that needed to be separated from the general population of Indonesians on board. So there was definitely this sort of separation on board. And we see this separation happening in a bunch of different ways. I know that we don't have that much time, so I'm going to try and go through this really quickly. But in addition to sort of these controlled surveillance and sort of policing tactics, also, I mean, ships provided a way to sort of resist these colonial surveillance tactics. And you see that on board the Hajj ships in terms of the consumer power of the pilgrims themselves. Because there were 3 different companies within the monopoly, pilgrims could start choosing amongst the 3 companies and tended to choose, in particular, the one company that actually was part of the Blue Funnel Line that was technically a British-owned company, but sailed under Dutch flag and had all Dutch officers and captains working on board. But they had lower death rates on board their ships, and they had better policies in terms of seeing people off. Like if your family came with you to the ship, you could actually go on board the ship and help get your relatives settled. And these were the kinds of policies that pilgrims themselves as consumers began sort of using their consumer power to force the other two companies to start making changes. And I put this up here, the daily rations, because food became a major source of sort of consumer power on board these ships, of the kind of food that people wanted. And so a lot of pilgrims were able to actually make demands and have the shipping companies change their policies. The final thing I want to just bring up very quickly is that in 1930, there was an attempt by the organization Muhammadiyah to actually start their own Hajj shipping company. And this was couched really in religious terms that, pilgrims shouldn't be traveling on board Dutch ships to do the pilgrimage, and essentially was selling this shipping service as being like a much better experience and a more religious experience. And the Dutch government worked together with Kongsijtiga officials to actually create new laws that made it impossible for Muhammadiyah to raise enough money to actually start their own shipping line, right? So they set like a 90,000 guilder amount of money that you had to have in a Dutch bank to be able to start your shipping line. And of course, although Muhammadiyah tried, they did all of this grassroots fundraising, were ultimately unable to come up with that amount of money. Okay. So in part 2, I look at, the extension of sort of Hajj surveillance and policing to Jeddah, but really to Mecca and even further afield to Cairo, as the sort of network that gets built to track these pilgrims all the way from the time they leave they leave colonial Indonesia to when they actually return to colonial Indonesia. And this was done largely through the Dutch consulate in Jeddah, and consulates were used very extensively by the Dutch government to create these surveillance and what I would call really spying networks. In Jeddah, the Indonesian employees of the consulate would be the ones who would be going into Mecca to actually go and see what people were up to talk to them, to get tabs on them. The consulate was very interested in students specifically and would go to educational institutions, both in Mecca and in Cairo as well, to sort of track exactly what students were learning, what the curriculum was. And of course, the fear was that the Hajj itself was a space where there's such a mix of people from around the globe, many of whom are not living under European imperial control, others who are much further along in their sort of nationalist struggles against imperial control. If we think about Egypt, if we think about Morocco, if we think about Syria, this was one of the big concerns of the Dutch administration and of the shipping companies as well, right? Is that this would be a sort of place for the spread of pan-Islamic nationalism that could make its way back to the shores to the colony. Okay, so yeah, the Dutch spying networks, they happen through the consulate. I argue they happen through quarantine stations as well. And yeah, but I won't go too far into that. Okay. And here's just an immigration document to give you an idea of sort of the specificity of these sort of documents, right? You have pictures, you have fingerprints, and you have a lot of biographical information. So, the immigration documents, as well as sort of travel documents put together, they really do give the government like a lot of information about you. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk quickly about the Java, China, Japan line. And this was one of the largest Dutch shipping companies during the interwar period that transported both cargo and passengers between colonial Indonesia and China and Japan. And this shipping company is dealing with a very volatile change in terms of the Asian maritime world and Asian shipping during the 1920s and 30s. So they are very concerned with ways that they can better infiltrate Chinese markets, not just for passengers, but also for the shipment of cargo. One of their big issues that they had as a company was that they had to go through Chinese middlemen to organize the shipments, especially of cargo, but also there were Chinese passenger brokers who helped organize the movement of Chinese passengers. And they essentially they spend years and lots of money on trying out different ways to bypass Chinese middlemen, to go directly to their potential customers. You know, they teach all of these Dutch employees, you know, the language skills so they can communicate with local shippers and with local passengers. They try to cut out passenger bureaus and passenger brokers by directly dealing with passengers themselves. Ultimately, all of these attempts were not successful, but they sort of show you how companies, foreign shipping lines like the Java China Japan line, were increasingly worried over not just increasing maritime competition for Chinese markets, but also the fact that there's sort of growing anti-European sentiment that's happening within China itself. And one of the things that I talk about that shows this is this event that happens in 1931, where a Chinese woman who is traveling to Ambon to become a teacher, she is sexually assaulted on board a Java China Japan line ship by two of the Dutch officers. And the news of this assault leaks out, and essentially it turns into a boycott in Amoy of all Dutch ships. And the groups who are involved, the Chinese Seamen's Union is involved, and also other local groups. They use this assault on this woman, Xiao Jinan, as an example of the assault that's being perpetrated on China by the Netherlands. And some of the demands of these of the leaders of the boycott are saying not only do they want sort of the 19th century treaties between the Netherlands and China to be overturned that allow China to that allow the Dutch to have free economic, you know, activities in China. They want that overturned. And also they want the sort of discriminatory policies that are happening against Chinese communities within colonial Indonesia to stop, right? This is a time in the early 1930s when the Dutch government has started forcibly deporting Chinese residents, lawful residents of the Dutch colony, with the fear that these are sort of subversive people, that they're involved in the spread of communism somehow, that they're involved in anti-colonial activities, spreading propaganda, smuggling weapons. So a lot of Chinese people are being forcibly deported. And also, of course, you know, Chinese communities in general, due to the 1910 Dutch personhood law, which is sort of the cornerstone of apartheid, which sort of separates people in terms of their judicial, legal, cultural, social rights according to race, right? So there's also these critiques as part of this boycott against that specific law. So I just wanted to mention that to show the ways that also these it was very interesting that this sort of diasporic boycott happens through the maritime world, right? That the maritime world and shipping is essentially the way that people are able to at times express their frustration or their anger towards this colonial system. And we can understand that because Dutch ships sort of acted as really these sort of floating ambassadors of empire. You know, if you lived in Amoy, you wouldn't have seen much of the Dutch Empire, but then this huge ship pulls in with the Dutch flags, and this is sort of a symbol. This is an actual thing that you can sort of react against. So I think it's really interesting the way the maritime world also works to sort of pull together these very sort of diasporic protests, right? Protest movements. And that's just one example. How much time do I have left? Am I almost done? Or?
Sorry, Kris, it's, shall we say, how much more time do you need? Another 10 minutes?
I mean, sure.
Or would that be, okay,
yeah.
So let's say between 5 and 10 minutes, and then you'll get a chance to, of course, say more when the questions begin.
Great, okay. So I'm just going to end by talking a little bit more about the passenger liners, the Dutch mails that are to the Rotterdam Lloyd and the Stoomvaartmaatschappij Nederland, and you'll see that these are connecting Europe with go all through the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, across the Indian Ocean, and onto colonial Indonesia. And in my book, I sort of talk about the ways that these passenger liners help to sort of teach imperial norms, imperial hierarchical norms, and the expected behavior of not just Europeans, but also the Indonesian crew members who work on board these ships. And this is done by, when European passengers come on board the ship, they are given these little booklets that essentially tell them who the other passengers are, so you can arrange your social get-togethers, but also give them a list of Malay commands that they are supposed to use with their stewards who take care of their cabins and also serve them at table, and also the babus who are, the rice babus, the travel nannies who are looking after many of the children on board as well. In addition to this, on board these ships, it was also common practice for Dutch officers, and sometimes the captain of the ship himself, to bring first and second class passengers to view third and sometimes fourth class Asian passengers. So the third class also had Europeans in it, but Europeans and non-Europeans were separated in the class. In the third class, they stayed in different areas and they ate different food, they ate in different places. And I just wanted to point this out as another way that sort of the disparate identities of course, like a lot of Europeans are coming onto these ships thinking of themselves in sort of these national identities, and that the passenger ships, Dutch passenger ships, help them to sort of feel like they had a combined identity, a common identity that was essentially based on race, and that the ocean became a place where these sort of colonial norms would be instilled before you actually reached the colony itself. So I kind of make that argument, and there's a lot more in that chapter as well. And finally, my last chapter is about Japanese competition, shipping competition, and the increase in sort of what the Dutch called Japanese penetration into Southeast Asian economy during the 1930s, and especially the ways that Japanese shipping companies became extremely confrontational with Dutch shipping companies who through the conference system had sort of enjoyed these sort of monopolies over certain lines. And throughout the early 1930s and the mid 1930s, these Japanese shipping lines increasingly are refusing to respect the Dutch conference lines. And the trade negotiations and the shipping negotiations that happened in the mid 1930s involved not only these sort of economic issues, but also both the Japanese interest and Dutch interest wind up spreading lots of propaganda about their side of the issue to local communities in Indonesia. And we see this especially in Batavia in 1934, when there's a big trade and shipping negotiation that happens between the two of these. Okay, so that said, I'm going to skip to my conclusion here. And just want to say that this book and my research in general contributes to a growing body of scholarship that seeks to decolonize Dutch imperial history, which, as I was talking with Itzi before this talk began, is a subject that's really hampered by a Dutch collective memory that's filled with taboos and silences over its colonial past. The longstanding belief of the Dutch Empire's benign exceptionalism began in the early 19th century, when smallness and even mediocrity were embraced as this fundamental national virtue. So Dutch benign exceptionalism has helped to obscure the more unseemly aspects of the Netherlands' colonial past, and most notably the erasure of colonial violence, referring to military offenses as pacifications and war crimes as excesses, which is currently being addressed by scholars at the NIOD Institute in Amsterdam. So this emerging field, sometimes some people call it the new Dutch imperial history. It moves beyond concepts of benign exceptionalism and other apologist ideologies to explore how hierarchies of race, class, and gender, and hegemonic systems of power, and imperial violence and oppression helped shape the Dutch Empire. And this book, Subversive Seas, contributes to this growing body of historical research seeking to decolonize the Dutch colonial past by using a transoceanic lens to critically reevaluate the late colonial period. Oceanic decolonization provides imperial historians with a very powerful tool in reconceptualizing modern empires, not only asking them to interrogate archival materials in new ways, but really the oceanic world helps to complicate the established metropole-colony relationship by moving the metropole to the margin, and instead focusing on the interconstitutive networks that connect colonial Indonesia with literal peripheries around the globe. Incorporating transoceanic empire into the historiography of the 20th century specifically also exposes a myriad of global actors who engaged with and were influenced by the Dutch Empire, and I think helped provide a voice for sort of the other that's hidden within colonial archives. Finally, transoceanic analyses require historians to complicate colonial government and business archives by challenging the narratives hegemonic colonial institutions tell about themselves and exposing everyday acts of resistance within systems of oppression. So ultimately, incorporating transoceanic empires into 20th century historiography illuminates both the regulatory aspects of the terrestrial world and the transgressive aspects of the oceanic world, and ultimately provides a picture of a very multifaceted, chaotic, and complex world, oceanic and terrestrial, that sort of overlap, mingle, and collide with one another. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kris. That was really good. You've covered a lot of ground, so you've given us lots to think about. If